Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see you here at High Level Week. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and to those joining us from around the world online, a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Catherine Amirfar. I have the privilege of serving as the Deputy Chair of the High Level Panel of Legal Experts on Media Freedom. And on behalf of the High Level Panel, I'd like to say that we are absolutely delighted to be here on this occasion with our co-host, the Czech Republic, for the 77th UN General Assembly. So our topic today is critical. It's the safety of journalists at risk worldwide. And as you're aware, the issue of safe refuge has been at the forefront of the priorities of the 51 member states that comprise the Media Freedom Coalition since it was established in 2019. In the coalition's first ministerial communiqué, and that was in November 2020, ministers chose first, and this is significant, but first, to call on all members of the MFC, and I'm going to quote it, to consider safe refuge for journalists at risk who have been targeted for their work. This was unequivocally a call to action. The question after this call then became how, where, when. The when was easy, immediately. The how took some work. In other words, what can states do to strengthen the framework of existing protection above and beyond what they were already doing and above and beyond what already existed? We'd like to think that the question was answered in large part by the great work of the high-level panel of legal experts in its capacity as the coalition's independent advisory body. The answer took the form of an advisory report addressed to all MFC states published in November 2020 and authored by my dear colleague and my other deputy chair, Jan Yeginsu. And we'll hear more from Jan in just a moment. So the panel made very specific recommendations, and that's the key, specific recommendations as to what states could do. Each recommendation was grounded in international legal obligations and was meant to address a gap or problem, something that did not exist. Each recommendation was a result of a truly remarkable consensus of experts. And by that I mean it was formally endorsed by the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of freedom of opinion and expression, the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression of the Inter-American Commission, as well as every major international NGO working to promote and protect media freedom. It's really a dizzying array of consensus and support. The panel's first recommendation was one that garnered most traction. I'm happy to say that, the most traction within MFC states, international organizations, civil society. It was for the creation of an emergency visa for journalists at risk. This was a novel solution to a growing problem: how to get a journalist out of harm's way immediately, in time to be effective. The problem has only grown, as we all know, since 2020. We've seen more and more journalists targeted for their work. We've seen what's happened in the crises in Syria, Afghanistan, and by virtue of Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. Today, we are going to discuss what has been done following the panel's recommendations and what more can be done as a coalition. I am just so delighted to be here with you, Your Excellency. We have Our Excellency Jan Lipavsky, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, and our special guest, journalist Roman Anin, and Jodie Ginsberg, President of the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, and of course, Jan, who's going to be addressing the report that he authored on safe refuge. So in terms of the order of the day, I'll be addressing a few questions to our honored guests, and then we'll get some interventions from the floor, and then we'll open it up, hopefully, in the last 10 minutes to questions from all of you. For those of us joining online, please do take this moment or throughout the panel to put in your questions into the Q&A box on the Zoom. Minister, Your Excellency, great to be here with you. The high-level panel, I don't know what word to use. It was heartened, gratified, excited. We were just unbelievably impressed to see the Czech Republic give effect to the panel's emergency visa recommendation as part of its broader commitments to media freedom. And this was at the coalition's meeting in Estonia in February. Since then, we understand that the Czech Republic has granted hundreds of emergency visas to journalists and activists at risk, principally for those having to flee Belarus and Russia. Please tell us more about efforts in your country. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for doing this event and for the possibility to be here. Honorable colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. This is very timely meeting, and it's a big pleasure to be here and address you on behalf of the Czech Republic. You mentioned that in your introductory remarks that during the recent years we have been witnessing challenging developments in the media landscape. And we are not only speaking about situation in Russia and Belarus. The growing number of attacks on and repression on journalists with a clear aim to muzzle all independent voices in many countries are happening also in Myanmar, Afghanistan, and many others. Targeted disinformation campaigns worldwide or misuse of digital technologies leading to further restriction of media freedom is also in motion. And unprecedented and unprovoked military aggression of Russia against Ukraine also caused further worsening of the media freedom situation in the eastern neighborhood of the EU. Not only 15 Ukrainian as well as foreign journalists have been killed directly on and next to the battlefields in Ukraine, but many others were forced to flee their country or to go deeply underground in both Russia and Belarus. They are in need of help and assistance in order to survive and able to continue working in their professions, to provide independent news to the public. Now it is not only time to react, it is time to act in a decisive and proactive way. And I'm proud that in the Czech Republic we have been able to do so in many ways. As a new member of the executive group of the Media Freedom Coalition, we have further stepped up our engagement in this regard, and our embassies in Minsk and Hanoi recently took the lead in coordination on local level. As we have declared at the Summit for Democracy, we will continue our bilateral support to independent media and media literacy, which consists now more than €1 million earmarked for such projects this year. And we are ready to unite our voices and speak out for media freedom alone and with our coalition partners on the international scene, be it in the UN, regional organizations like OSCE, Council of Europe, or elsewhere. And it goes hand in hand with our earmarked voluntary contributions to the international organizations, including to the Global Media Defense Fund and the OECD representative on freedom of media. Not only declarations, but concrete deeds are what matters the most right now. We need to ensure accountability for acts against media freedom and safety of journalists. An effective sanctions regime is a priority of my government. We are currently working on Czech version of Magnitsky Act. I'm sure you are all aware what Magnitsky Acts mean. It's a basically sanction law which can then sanction someone who perpetrates something against human rights, and of course acts against journalism fits into this definition. So the draft law on the Czech national sanction regime is now undergoing approval process in our parliament, and I hope for its swift and effective implementation afterwards, basically hopefully in few months. Thanks to its headquarters in Prague, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, plays an important part in our independent media support. We are grateful for their work, and I'm happy that both our common projects for young independent journalists from Eastern Partnership, Western Balkans countries and Russia are running smoothly. The fellows represent the future for independent journalism in their home countries. In line with the recommendation of the high-level legal panel of experts on media freedom, we have been working hard to support independent journalists, pro-democratic civil society activists, and human rights defenders fleeing from Russia and Belarus after the invasion. We have provided hundreds of them with emergency fast-tracking visa during the last 7 months. That goes what you mentioned in the question which was pointed to me. In May, our government also launched a tailor-made long-term resident permit program called Civil Society for endangered journalists and civil society representatives from Russia and Belarus. In close partnership with Czech NGOs, we support their relocation to the Czech Republic. And now I am speaking about dozens of individuals being preceded by this program. Here I can firmly state that we are honored by the decision to resettle to Czechia, and we stand ready to provide them with any further support needed.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think you said it best when you said concrete deeds are what matters most. Other state members like Lithuania, Germany, Estonia, they have assisted in creating analogous emergency relief programs. We have the co-chair Canada, who has also been first to enact one of the best international protection streams in the world. But here we are, and the world needs more. What would you say to other member states or non-member states of the coalition? As a country that's decided to make it a national priority, what would you say to them is needed in this moment?
That's a very good question, and I have two answers, and I won't be long. So, both our project or visa support won't be possible without an extraordinary and close partnership with Czech and Prague-based NGOs. And this is also built on mutual trust and long-term cooperation. We see close governmental and non-governmental cooperation as some kind of cornerstone of any success and sustainable intervention in the field of boosting a transition towards true democratization. So my recommendation would be to closely cooperate with NGOs since the division of labor in state is necessary to have a state actor and non-governmental actor who can do much more effectively, but without those tools, and the state provides those tools, and once that put together, it creates an effect which really helps to someone, for example, to relocate or to do some kind of projects. And the second point, we need to see media freedom as a crucial component of democracy and an important component of our human rights support around the world. To us, strengthening resilience of democratic institutions is the only way to sustain our democracies in the long term. So we have no other choice than to support democratic institutions. I will recall here the belief of our late President Václav Havel in the transformation power of free speech and the process of constituting more open and democratic societies. And that means that this needs to be put into the policy of state as such, and then it creates these effects when the real work is done. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wise words indeed. Jan, I want to turn over to you. You spent a lot of time becoming an expert on this topic when you wrote the panel report on safe refuge. So we've obviously heard from the Czech Republic, a state that has decided to make this a national priority and taking concrete action. Could you do a little table setting in terms of the context, the recommendations, and perhaps most importantly, what are the challenges that lie ahead as the Media Freedom Coalition seeks to build momentum?
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. And just by way of opening, it's very, very good to be here, and I'm pleased, in fact delighted, that the Czech Republic and the Media Freedom Coalition's high-level panel of legal experts has come together in this way at the UN General Assembly to focus on this critical issue, echoing you, Minister, at a critical time. When the Media Freedom Coalition and its independent panel of experts was established in 2019, the high-level panel itself designated the issue of safe refuge as a top priority. We encouraged as a panel the coalition, then co-chaired by Canada and the United Kingdom, to make it a top priority too. And they listened. And as you referred to, Catherine, in your opening, safe refuge was at the top of the coalition's first ministerial communique. Our chair, Lord Neuberger, and our inaugural chair, Amal Clooney, asked me to lead the panel's work in this area. And as a panel, we produced an advisory report, here it is, with individual recommendations to states. But in making those individual recommendations, we focused not only on what needed to be done, but also how they could do it. The emergency visa was one of our headline recommendations, and we were clear that it was to be used sparingly in the face of a genuine emergency and a genuine risk. And we really built out what that visa would look like and how it would work. The good news, and there is so little good news these days, is that some of the coalition states moved to implement our recommendations. The co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition, Canada, established a first-of-its-kind international protection scheme for human rights defenders and journalists. The other co-chair, current co-chair of the coalition, the Netherlands, saw a bill pass its parliament last year for the creation of an emergency visa for journalists at risk to give effect to the panel's recommendation. I was with Ministers Jodie and Hoekstra on Tuesday to address the representatives of the Media Freedom Coalition. Both ministers signalled that journalistic safety was going to remain a continuing priority for Canada and the Netherlands in their capacity as co-chairs of the Media Freedom Coalition, and will be working with the co-chairs to further strengthen their own mechanisms for safe refuge. The Czech Republic, member of the executive group that has showed real commitment in this area. And Minister, I speak for the high-level panel, but I know also for civil society and journalists in commending what your country has done. Before the unlawful and violent invasion of Ukraine, your country committed in Estonia to establish and provide emergency visas for journalists at risk. And that commitment was, as we've heard, quickly followed with action through the issuing of hundreds of emergency visas. Your country wasn't alone. Germany also provided a commitment in Estonia to provide emergency visas. Ireland committed to providing safe passage. And since the invasion, as Catherine made mention of, Lithuania has stepped up, Estonia has stepped up, both Media Freedom Coalition states. So we have the beginnings of some momentum. But there are, in my view, Catherine, I'm coming to the challenges now, two clear and immediate challenges. The first is this. These efforts need to be sustained and they need to be put on a strong formal footing. There needs to be the sort of formal emergency visa provision for journalists at risk as being contemplated in the Netherlands. Democracies need to show the world that this is a concrete mechanism that can be deployed in a range of emergencies and in a range of situations. The second challenge is this. This is a priority area for the coalition. The coalition said so itself through its ministers. It's also a priority area for the high-level panel. And yet, we have only seen a handful of states act. The reality is, and it's a straightforward reality, more states need to establish an emergency visa for journalists at risk. Last year, Amal Clooney and I called for a minimum of 50 such visas a year to all members of the Media Freedom Coalition. It's hardly a big ask, but it would have an enormous impact if implemented by the coalition's 52 members. And as I said on Tuesday in my address to the coalition states, this Media Freedom Coalition is going to be judged not on the beauty of its words, but on the quality of its deeds. So we look forward to working with the Czech Republic, with the Netherlands, with Canada, in spearheading the coalition's efforts in this regard, in the hope that this can be a legacy initiative for which this coalition of democracies can be proud. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you, Jan. So I want to turn now to the why. I think all of us would easily come to consensus that media freedom is an important principle. It's a pillar of democracy. That's easily done. But sometimes with these large principles, we forget what's at stake. We forget what's happening on the ground. We forget the lives at stake. So we're particularly lucky to have with us today Roman Anin, who's going to talk to us about exactly that. What is it like? And Roman, unfortunately, and I'm very sorry that you've had to experience this in your life, but you have experienced firsthand the very real threats that journalists are facing today. Could you please just relay a bit in these few minutes to everyone here what that's like?
Okay, so I started my career in 2006, and when I came to Novaya Gazeta, Anna Politkovskaya was still alive. It's actually very interesting. Anna Politkovskaya is one of the most known Russian journalists. She was killed in 2006 by people close to Kadyrov. And I remember it was so interesting when I was reading her stories from Chechnya. I couldn't imagine that they were true. I was like 19 years old, and I was sometimes like saying that it can't be true. And today I'm the editor of a media outlet that is investigating horrible war crimes committed by the Russian army in Ukraine, and probably many people in Russia also read them and can't believe that they are true. Anyways, what I want to say is that when I came to Novaya Gazeta, it had only two people, two portraits of people in the newsroom, portraits of killed people. I always mention their names because it's not only important to remember them, but it also proves that in Russia, any type of independent journalism is dangerous, not only investigative. So I was the head of investigative section that had the name of, because I wanted to say has the name, but Novaya Gazeta doesn't exist anymore. Its license was recently revoked, which had the name of Yuri Shikachyhin, one of the first Novaya Gazeta reporters who was poisoned by secret services for investigating the corruption within the secret services. Then Igor Domnikov was killed. He was investigating local authorities. I wouldn't even say investigating, he was criticizing local authorities, and he was cruelly killed by a gang. And in 15 years, Novaya Gazeta was able to find out the name of the guy who ordered the killing. It was the governor of the Lipavsky region, and nothing happened to him. Because 15 years had passed, and the maximum time for this crime had already gone. Then Anna Politkovskaya was killed for writing about Northern Caucasus. Then Natalia Estemirova was killed for writing about the same Northern Caucasus. And then two my amazing colleagues, one of them a young girl who was brought to Novaya Gazeta by my friend, Anastasia Baburova, and an amazing lawyer, Stanislav Markelov, who was simultaneously killed on the streets of Moscow. And I was a young reporter in Novaya Gazeta, and I remember that I was sent by the newsroom to kind of walk around and to talk to people, try to find potential witnesses. I mean, it's hard to see bodies of your colleagues on the streets on the pavements, of Moscow, and kind of realizing that you can't do anything. Anastasia was writing about neo-Nazis. So you can see that it's not only about investigative reporting; it's about any type of independent journalism. But today I represent iStories, a media outlet that I started 2.5 years ago after graduating after finishing my fellowship at Stanford University. So when I came back to Russia from the US, I remember that the very first lecture that we had in the newsroom of iStories was about how to behave yourself when you face potential risk of searches in your apartment or in the office. And that was a very wise decision because in less than half a year, one evening when I went to swim at the swimming pool, officers of FSB, the major Russian secret service, approached me and said that they want to conduct a search in my apartment. So they searched my apartment for 8 hours. Then I was detained. They also searched the apartment of iStories, and they also wanted to search an apartment of my parents. At least that's what I see from the documents from the criminal case. I don't know why they didn't do that. But I was detained, interrogated twice, and the pretext of a criminal case is really ridiculous. They're accusing me of publishing private photos of ex-wife of one of the most powerful people from Russia, Yeginsu, even despite the fact that I took those photos from her Instagram. And the Russian Supreme Court says that, of course, everything that was published voluntarily by a person can't be the matter of his or her private life. Anyways, the investigative committee doesn't care. So the case is still being investigated. It happened in April. In the end of May, I went on vacations to see my relatives in Kiev, to see my relatives in Odessa, because part of my family comes from Ukraine, and that was the last time I've visited this amazing country. I made this decision. I wanted to go back to Russia, but I started calling all my sources, and all of them were telling me that if I go back, I most likely will be arrested. And I decided to stay, not to go back, which was planned. Today, I realized that it was a good and wise decision because it gave me some time to create an infrastructure for them when the war started. So when the war started, iStories was proclaimed an undesirable organization. Until recently, we were the only Russian media that was simultaneously a foreign agent and undesirable organization. Since recently, Insider was also received the second medal. Being undesirable means that by just admitting the fact that I work for iStories, I committed a crime and I can be sentenced to 6 years of prison. All my reporters commit a crime as well, and they can be sentenced to 4 years of prison. And every reader who reposts our story commits a crime and can be sentenced to 4 years of prison. So can you imagine a journalist who had to come up with a call to his audience saying, please don't repost us? Usually journalists kind of act vice versa. They ask the audience to repost them. We had to say, please don't repost us, or if you do that, you gotta understand that you are facing big risks. We also had to cut off all the donations. We were doing quite well in crowdfunding, and it was a significant part of our budget. So we had to cut it off because, again, every person who donates to iStories can be sentenced to 4 years of prison. But even being undesirable is not the biggest problem. You can say, okay, what is then the biggest problem if you can be sentenced to 6 years of prison for just, being a journalist? Well, of course, after the war started, the Kremlin has adopted numerous laws that, as you know, prohibit people from calling this war war. You can be sentenced to 15 years of prison for just calling this war war. Or for spreading fakes about the Russian army. And of course, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, everything that happened in Bucha is fake. So that is why when the war started, we had this choice between three options. Either stay in Russia and stop our work, stay in Russia, continue our work and end up in jail, or relocate the newsroom. I mean, all options are actually bad. Relocation is not the best option as well because I strongly believe that journalists need to live in the country they write about. And I still believe it. So it creates a lot of troubles and problems for us how to kind of keep the connection with the country. We have a couple of ideas that we follow, but anyway, relocation is not the best option. But today I'm really happy that we decided to do that because we were able to publish a number of really important stories that, as we see, are resonating among the Russian audience. Like we were the first media that not only was able to prove some of the terrible crimes that had been committed by the Russian army, but we also were the only media that talked to a Russian soldier who actually confessed to committing war crimes. And that was a very powerful and great story that I know was viewed by many Russians and Russians in the front line. And we know that it's changing minds of people. So that's what we face, and probably the last thing that I wanted to mention is that, of course, now, I mean, since the majority of the team is in Europe, you can say, well, everything is great and safe, which is, yeah, true. I mean, of course, we're really thankful to Czech Republic, to countries like Lithuania, Latvia, who were helping us with visas. It's great. But simultaneously, I want to sublime that maybe it's just, credit that I want to pay to my reporters. They are doing a great job, but we have 3 cases in our newsroom when reporters don't talk to their parents because their parents support the war. So my reporters are hated by sometimes their families. They're definitely hated by at least half of Russian population who supports the war and thinks that they're traitors. Of course, they're hated by the majority of Ukrainians, and sometimes they're hated by all the others. So these are one of the most hated people on earth. And despite this hatred, they still believe in their mission, and they still continue publishing these stories because they know that their stories are so important during the war.
Thank you so much, Roman, for sharing that. Let me ask you just one more question. What would you say to the states that are part of the Media Freedom Coalition?
I would say that, first of all, I think we all gotta understand and agree that whatever happens to Russia, whether it will be, I don't know, one country or many countries or whatever happens there, still there are more than 140 million people, and they will still live there. And that means that, we should not probably forget about these people, and you need to understand that people in Russia will not trust Ukrainian media. People in Russia will not trust the yes media. People in Russia will not trust any other media. So Russian media is the only mediator between the Russian audience and the rest of the world. So if we wanna tell something to the Russian people, the Russian media is the best way to do that. And also, if we want to know what the Russian audience is thinking about some of the problems, again, the Russian media is probably the best way to do it. So I think, just keeping it in mind is really important. And also, simultaneously, I want to say that, today the Russian media is doing really important work, not only iStories, but also other media outlets that had to relocate their newsrooms. I've mentioned this one particular story, but overall we've identified more than 15 war criminals, like concrete soldiers with concrete names who committed concrete crimes. And I know that our investigations are already used, our findings are already used by the official investigators in Ukraine and in other countries. I know that because, these people got in touch with me. Yes, maybe we are not changing that fast the perceptions of Russian people, and maybe where they are what they think about the war is still not something that we want them to think. But first of all, unfortunately, it's not a sprint; it's a marathon, and unfortunately, our resources in comparison with the resources of propaganda are not equal. The budget of RT for 2 years is $1.5 billion. I won't even tell you what is the budget of iStories, but believe me, it's less than 1 million. And they have thousands of people, and they are protected by secret services, by Roskomnadzor, and they are not blocked. So it's hard. But again, Russian people will trust Russian media, and if you want to know what's going on in Russia, you need Russian media.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Jodie, over to you. So CPJ has been such a critical and valuable partner for the high-level panel. Can you tell us why? Why have you endorsed the report, the work, the recommendations?
Well, I think you just heard it, right?
Yeah.
You just heard it. We know from 40 years of work that being able to find safe refuge, a place and a mechanism to leave a dangerous country is vital not only for the survival of journalists, but actually for journalism. And there's a very clear reason for that. So when you see times of political unrest, political suppression, journalists are very often the first people targeted. They're the ones doing the investigations. They're the ones exposing the political corruption, the injustice. And in order to silence them, they are therefore targeted. They're either targeted with threat of imprisonment or, more worryingly, the threat of death, imminent danger, torture, killing. This year alone, we at CPJ have documented at least 30 killings of journalists and media workers in relation to their work. And you might say, well, that's expected. We're in a time of conflict. But nearly half of those are murders outside of a conflict zone. So journalists who are reporting on political issues, issues of corruption are at risk. And when they know they're at risk, if they're about to publish a story or they've had intelligence, they need to be got to a place of safety extremely quickly. They don't have time to go through the rigmarole of a 6-month visa process. They need to be got out very fast and given a safe place of rest and repose. And so that's why we've supported this. It's really important to understand, we've heard the challenges faced by Russian and Ukrainian journalists, and we're all aware of the enormous challenges that were faced by Afghan journalists last year. But it's also important to remember that these are not isolated to conflict zones. This is happening in every continent and in almost every country, that there is somebody at grave risk. And so it's really important that we have a broad coalition, as Jan has already said, of countries willing to take individuals, because it isn't single conflicts. Often it's ongoing crises, and it's everywhere. We're seeing increasing numbers of journalists fleeing places like Nicaragua, for example. We need to make sure that we have a system that is operating globally and at scale in order for that to be successful. So that's why it's important. And most importantly, if you get out those journalists who have been trained, many of these countries who are attending today will have invested in that media to develop the media in that country. You know, a lot of work has gone into developing and making sure that you have skilled, capable journalists in countries. If you get them out quickly into a safe place, then it's more likely that they will then be able to return to continue to feed an independent media when things settle. So that's why, as well, it's really important that we have access to this kind of emergency visa safe refuge.
Thank you, Jodie. Ken, just one more question for you. You've heard of what I hope is a building momentum on emergency and safe refuge visas. What more needs to be done?
We need more. We need it at scale. And I would say there needs to be a recognition that this needs to be a broad coalition of countries and a very visible scheme. It's important that journalists know that they can access this. What we saw repeatedly what we've seen repeatedly in situations where journalists need to get out of a country quickly is they don't necessarily know the avenues to do so, and then they end up getting tied up in complex visa processes. So that needs to be both, we need more countries to sign up, as the Czech Republic has done, and commit to these visa processes. We need more visas, and we need them to be much more visible and to ensure that the processes through which journalists have to follow to get there are as simple as possible. And finally, what I would say, they must also take into account the fact that many of these journalists will have criminal records because of the nature of their work. And too often what we find is we end up in a tick box situation where you tick the box that says, do you have a criminal record? Yes. System rejects you, and it happens time and time again. And the system needs to be nuanced to understand that inevitably in these situations, journalists have already been targeted through the courts and will have criminal records, and that's part of the reason they need to be got out very quickly.
Thank you, Jodie. That's a very important, realistic reminder of the challenges faced. I think at this stage, we're going to turn to interventions from the room. First is a virtual one by Canada. Ms. Tara Denham, Deputy Director of Global Programs at Global Affairs Canada. Which will be up momentarily.
Confirmation if people can hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Excellent, thank you. Well, thank you again for letting me do this virtual intervention. I'm the Director General of the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion at Global Affairs Canada. And so again, thank you for hosting this event, and to the permanent mission of the Czech Republic to the United Nations and the high-level panel of legal experts for organizing the event, and of course for all of the partners and the speakers. I think this has been a very concrete reminder of the importance of the issues that we're talking about, and the importance to continue the actions and the concrete actions that we're taking. I'd particularly like to thank Mr. Roman and Anin for his intervention and reminding all of us of what this means in reality and what he and his colleagues live on a day-to-day basis. So thank you very much. Canada, as has been noted, remains very committed to providing refuge to those who fight for human rights around the world. So as was just noted, the need for to be broad and at scale. In this regard, I would like to thank the high-level panel of experts for their excellent report on providing safe refuge to journalists at risk. And as has been noted, Canada did announce in July 2021 the launch of a dedicated refugee stream for human rights defenders and including journalists. And so at that time, we committed to resettle up to 250 human rights individuals annually under this dedicated refugee stream. And that includes human rights defenders and their family members. And so we are proud to continue to offer this. And so far, as of this year, as of the end of August, it's actually approximately 270 human rights defenders that have arrived in Canada, so exceeding the original commitment that we made. So we do pledge to continue to engage with the high-level panel and members of the Media Freedom Coalition, and to continue to look at the recommendations and now what that looks like concretely to continue to move that forward. Thank you again, and I look forward to the other interventions and questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the leadership. Thank you for the great news about the oversubscription. We really appreciate your efforts, and I know that I speak on behalf of the legal panel that we really understand that it's the kind of actions and leadership shown by Canada that really gets it done. So thank you. Could I go to the United States, please? Ms. Lisa Peterson, Acting Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Hi, Lisa. Hi, nice to see you.
Am I on here? Okay, yes. So we've heard that this is an exceptionally trying time for journalists. We've seen how repressive regimes have been emboldened and really clamped down on media freedom across the globe, which has obviously forced many journalists into exile and has left many more in dangerous conditions where their lives may be at risk. I hope folks that saw that during his first day here in New York, Secretary Blinken met with freedom of expression activists, including courageous journalists from closed societies, and spoke to the press from our Foreign Press Center about freedom of expression as a necessary issue to address the important issues that we focused on throughout High Level Week, including upholding the UN Charter, improving global health, confronting disinformation, and advocating for food security. We see freedom of expression for journalists as integral to all of these efforts, and it's only possible when journalists can safely do their jobs. We are currently seeing how Russia is jeopardizing the safety of journalists, and we also clearly are seeing how journalists are facing challenges around the world. We've seen how the internet has expanded journalists' ability to connect with the public, but it's also created a space to harass and intimidate journalists. And we're particularly attentive to the especially high levels of attacks and abuse, both online and offline, that female journalists face, often through threats of physical or sexual violence. So for these reasons, we very much welcome the high-level legal panel's report on providing safe refuge to journalists at risk, and we look forward to working closely with the panel to learn more about the recommendations and how we can create systems that provide refuge to journalists under threat. I did want to take a moment to highlight several programs and efforts that the U.S. is launching related to journalist safety. First, we're investing up to $3.5 million to launch the Journalism Protection Platform that will promote and protect open and resilient information ecosystems. We're providing up to $9 million to support a global defamation defense fund for journalists, which will offer liability coverage for journalists and news organizations targeted with unjust litigation. To tackle the pervasive gender-based online harassment and abuse, violence, and gendered disinformation, that aims to silence so many women journalists, we've launched the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse to drive forward actions to counter and respond to these threats. And through the MFC's consultative network, the United States assists in drawing attention to and responding to cases where journalists are under threat. I hope that these efforts demonstrate just how seriously we take journalist safety. We look forward to continuing our work with the panel and the coalition to expand our commitment to protecting journalists and providing safe refuge to those under threat. Thank you all for inviting me to be here part of this event today.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the panel, I just wanted to say how much we appreciate the United States leadership and the executive group and all of those actions. Thank you very much. Could I go to Austria, please? Mr. Hans-Joachim Almos-Lechner, Deputy Permanent Representative of Austria to the UN. Please, sir.
Thank you very much. As we know, free, independent, and vibrant media is a cornerstone of any democratic society. It plays an indispensable role in informing the public during times of crisis. 2022 marks the 10th anniversary since the endorsement of the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. Important progress has been made at the international level in recognizing the safety of journalists as a precondition for freedom of expression, democracy, and sustainable development, as reflected in a number of resolutions and declarations by the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and many others, of course. However, despite all this progress, journalists and media workers continue to be killed or subject to high rates of detention, physical attacks, intimidation, as we have heard, using inter alia legal systems, harassment offline and online, including when covering protests. Women journalists are particularly exposed to online harassment, and impunity for these crimes committed remains the norm. Much more needs to be done from our point of view. Let me commend our host, the Czech Republic, for raising awareness during this important week of the year about the strategic importance of the safety of journalists for the achievement of sustainable development, the good functioning of democracy, the respect of the rule of law, and the exercise of all human rights. Austria invites all here today to the high-level multi-stakeholder conference organized by Austria, OHCHR, and UNESCO on 4th of November in Vienna. It aims to renew the international community's commitment for the continued implementation of the UN Plan of Action for the next 10 years. Broad multi-stakeholder commitment is essential for ending impunity and ensuring the safety of journalists wherever they are. I would further like to mention our strong model of cooperation with the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. We are working together towards implementation across all the high-level panels for advisory reports that focus on improving international mechanisms to enforce international human rights norms. We are doing this already with a view towards the conference in November. And if I may, I would like to ask our distinguished speakers one question, what you think about your expectations for the next decade of the UN Plan of Action when it comes to real-life impacts for journalists. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the intervention. We're very much looking forward to continuing to work with Austria and of course, being in beautiful Vienna on November 4th. Thank you very much. I will pause on that question, and we're going to come back to it. We have 2 more interventions, and we'll get through, but thank you for the question. Let me turn to Internews, Ms. Jean Bourgault, President and CEO. Okay, all right. We'll get to your question faster. Then U.S. AGM, please, Mr. David Kligerman, General Counsel and Board Secretary. Also not here. To your question. So the next 10 years under the UN Plan of Action, is that right? Okay, so who wants to take that question? Who wants to go first?
Jodie
I can
Ginsberg,
start.
I think.
Jo-
I was very much hoping to pass that on to you, Jan. Look, I think The past 10 years have made it very clear that the high-level commitments, as we've heard consistently, I think, in every single one of the panel's remarks, need to be met with concrete actions, and we haven't seen that as much as we had hoped, I think. I think the last 10 years have been good in raising awareness of the threats against journalists and the importance of their protection, but we've seen less in the way of concrete action to protect them. And so what I would be very much hoping from the next 10 years is that we see implementation, practical implementation of some of the elements that we've already discussed related to visas, refuge, but also systems to strengthen, for example, investigations into threats against journalists, the killing of journalists. We've referenced it before. Impunity remains extraordinarily high for the killings of journalists, creating an environment in which people think that attacks on journalists are fair game. So I think we need to strengthen the structures for the media to operate safely, and that includes making sure that we have strong legislature oversight and redress mechanisms that we haven't quite seen to this point. I'm going to hand back to you, Jan, because I feel that you might have something to say.
I'll just say a couple of things. When one thinks about just how much of a problem disinformation has become, even in the last 2 years, it was a problem before then, but just think about the deterioration, the media landscape, and the plague that is disinformation. Yes, a discussion has to be had as to how states interact with various tech companies, of course. But truth is decaying. And if journalists are not safe, then we lose a critical pillar of truth-telling. And therefore, really, this is no longer an issue merely of freedom of expression. This is an issue as to the existence or continued existence of a democracy. Because without truth, a democracy cannot flourish. So in the coming 10 years, yes, we need to deal with the new media landscape, including social media, but we also have to do much more to protect journalists. As Jodie said, investigations, that's an area that we've really been doing a lot of work on, we'll be continuing to do work on as a panel, but also states stepping up and protecting their own journalists through consular protections, diplomatic protection, when other states move against them, which is happening. It didn't used to happen 15 years ago as much. It was exceptional. Now it's no longer exceptional. So really the keynote is that democracies have to step up and not be afraid of offending some other states in the service of freedom of expression and in the service of democracy, because otherwise they won't be able to continue in their own existence, I think.
Thank you, Jan. The only thing I would add in terms of thinking about the 10-year trajectory is that, as Nobel laureate Maria Ressa likes to say, it's an all-of-society effort. We've talked today about safe refuge. There are 3 other enforcement reports that the panel is very much engaged on trying to implement, having to do with the use of sanctions in this space, the conduct of effective investigations when crimes are committed against reporters, and consular assistance. What does that look like when you're trying to protect reporters? This is just 4 issues that we've picked and prioritized, but there's so many more. So from the high-level panel perspective, it's also not resting on our laurels. There are these amazing enforcement reports. We're working with member states to get them implemented. At the same time, we need to be able to move with certain nimbleness to the issues as they arise. Disinformation is obviously top of the agenda. The other I would mention is cyber targeting, the use of cyber tools to go after journalists where they live, where their families are. This is part of the safe refuge, but it is a very potent device for harassment, intimidation, and in some cases, assassination. So from a high-level panel perspective, we're constantly asking ourselves the question, what is needed now and now and now to constantly stay ahead of this? Because as we can all agree, truth is under siege, democracy is under siege by extension, and it is an all-of-society effort. So I think we only get there in 10 years if we do it together. So let me ask if there's any other questions. I think we have time for one question from the floor. Would you like to duke it out to see who goes? If we could get the microphone over. I believe that gentleman was first.
Okay, it's possibly less a question than a comment. I've been following, I was actually at the launch of the UN Action Plan 10 years ago. And I've often thought that if we had just implemented it, if we had done it the way it was intended. When I hear the conversation here, we are talking as if we are from outside going to, as an international organization, ensure that national journalists, which still are the ones that are mostly attacked, will protect them, that we can protect them. In the UN Action Plan, there is this all-of-society approach, but it's at a national level. Most journalists work still at a very local and national level. And the investment of resources in what is in the UN Action Plan called safety mechanisms, which is bringing all the different actors together at a national level. It's not us as international organization. The investment in national actors that can ultimately protect themselves, help each other to protect those journalists that are most vulnerable. And I think we have to remember that. I think that's what Marie Reza would say also in Philippines. It's only now, 10 years after the UN Action Plan, that they're actually setting up and have resources to set up a national protection mechanism in the Philippines. So it's a question of resources that goes in the right direction. So we shouldn't pretend that we, sitting here in New York, can actually do the job. It's investing at national level in those organizations and institutions that are going to protect journalists on a daily basis.
Thank you very much. And that comment takes us back to actions matter. So we're at time, and at High Level Week, as we all know, it's a very, very tough schedule. So with that, let me bring this to a close. Thank you very much for being with us today. And thank you to the speakers.